So the idea of my talk today is challenge the consensus. Get to it in a second. I'll tell you a bit about PolicyTracker and Signal Tracker, what we do, and then I'm going to go through some common claims that I'd like to talk about, and maybe what our data internally can tell us about these claims. Open up to questions as well. We have a panel right afterwards, which is great. I'm sure some of these things will come up. And you'll be aware of PolicyTracker. We have a news arm, and then we also have a research arm. Publishing our newsletter since 2004. That's been around for a long time. And I think our key value is impartiality. There's a lot of voices in spectrum policy, a lot of perspectives, a lot of stakeholders who have a legitimate interest in particular spectrum bands. Not too many independent players who can sort of take a step back and look things with a sort of more neutral perspective. So I think that's our value, and that's what I'll try to bring to the discussion today as well. And probably haven't heard of Signal Tracker. This is our new initiative. It's basically an app that we developed that measures mobile connectivity, collects data on upload, download speed, signal strength, spectrum bands used as well. I'm sort of working on integrating that into our existing database for our subscribers at the moment. Some of it is already available through our Data Explorer. If you want to download the app, there's a QR code there. It's only on Android, unfortunately. For technical reasons, you can't measure these things on iPhones. Fancy animation. And the impetus for this sort of keynote was you hear a lot of, I can already see people gasping at some of these things, claims going around in spectrum policy. There's a lot of people who feel very strongly one way or the other. I think because spectrum bands often are exclusively assigned, feel like an all or nothing area. And I think because of that, a lot of industries sort of defend the line and they're always on the offense, and it makes sense. But I think a lot of these issues are maybe more nuanced than we hear about them in policy circles that we live in.
The only thing I would say is not necessarily about the industry, correct? Sometimes it's one company or a group of, like the one on the UHF, you know, the death of cultural industry, that's not true. That's not our position, and you know who I'm talking about. But another companies, you know, whose name starts with an S also, we don't agree with this type of statements. We want to be more constructive.
Who inspired that one? Yeah, well, don't look at these too closely. Those are just examples. So the idea is to look at what the data can tell us. I think it's very rare that one argument is objectively correct or objectively wrong. I think often it comes down to what the priorities are for a regulator in a specific country. I think in some cases we have data that can maybe get us closer to the truth or maybe closer to an answer. And I'm not here to sort of debunk any of these things or sort of say these are completely wrong, but just sort of adding more context and looking at what objective facts we have to support the map from our a signal survey we did in central London. It was a nice visual. It's little to do with the rest of the text. Yeah, so the first claim I want to look at is spectrum costs for the mobile industry. I think really high level, we hear, we have heard for some time, that spectrum costs are sort of a pressure on the mobile industry. I think broadly speaking, the argument is they're a burden, and high spectrum costs hurt investment, and countries with lower spectrum costs tend to have better outcomes. I think there's some common things you hear on the mobile industry. This chart on the right here is from a GSMA report from May that looked at spectrum pricing. I don't want to go too hard on this report because I actually think the report itself is not that bad, and I would encourage you all to read it. But I think the headline figure that they took from it is a bit misleading. So it says that spectrum costs now account for 7% of operator revenues and represent a 63% increase over the past decade. That was sort of the headline figure that they chose to use when promoting this report. And I think it's potentially a bit misleading because if you look at spectrum costs, they are falling. I think in some cases, it's true that high spectrum costs are a burden. I think there's particular markets where that definitely is the case. But overall, the reality is spectrum costs have been declining. And this data from our own database, average US dollar megahertz pop, going back 30 years to 1995. You'll see the 3G peak there. 5G peak is a little bit less visible. But that's the global picture. The issue often comes when you start applying sort of grand arguments about spectrum cost onto every country when individual countries have such different situations. India is always said an example where spectrum costs are very high. I think it does have a negative impact. All your lots sell at the reserve price in an auction. It's probably not a good thing, I'd say. So yeah, I think the truth is that if we go back to the GSMA figures, part of their argument is linking spectrum to revenue, right? Basically, they say we've needed more spectrum over the years with 5G and things like that, but also our revenues have gone down in that time. And if you link that to spectrum costs, that's how you can tell this picture. So this is not incorrect, but it's a particular way to tell the story where you're plugging other things into it. Overall, costs are actually falling. And I think in many cases, especially when you have auctions, the costs are reflecting the value of the spectrum, which is changing. Just had the millimeter wave auction in the UK, which sold for the reserve price. I think it went into round 2. There was no competitive bidding. And I think that isn't not necessarily a bad thing. I think we like to measure auctions based on price, but sometimes if the price is reserve price, it means it sold for its for a more realistic value. And it reflects the economic value of that spectrum as well.
So is the conclusion from your 2 slides that just the revenues of mobile operators have decreased because the cost for the spectrum has decreased, but it's just that their revenue has decreased, so the ratio is just increased?
Basically, I think mobile operators are making less revenue per megahertz of spectrum. I don't know if linking those 2 things are they correlated? Probably not. But it's true that they're getting less dollar value out of each megahertz, and I think that's true. But we shouldn't lose track of the bigger picture, which is that costs are declining, and in many countries reflecting that change in value.
So maybe they have too much spectrum. They would get more out of it if they had less, maybe.
Is that a quote?
Another way of seeing it. Yeah.
Maybe a follow-up question: how you would compare Europe with US on that particular point on the spectrum having a cost decline?
The US is very interesting because spectrum is really expensive in the US, and I think many reasons for that, but it's quite financialized. You see a lot of investment bodies buying spectrum, leasing spectrum, sort of a trading game that goes on. I'd say the US is a bit of an outlier with spectrum costs, but it's also a bit of an outlier with revenues. So I think in US operators, you don't hear them complain too often about the cost of spectrum. They can afford it, I think. So this is a good example where spectrum costs have risen, I think. Should make this chart with the US because I think that it would show that it would be.
Can I have one question?
Yeah.
So the value of spectrum really depends on which bands you are talking about. All these numbers that you are showing, they consider all bands, like including millimeter wave.
But there hasn't been that many millimeter wave auctions in here compared to all the other bands, so I think it's not distorting the numbers too much. Putting some new charts together on pricing because there's all these nuances like I said. I'll move on to the second claim. This one is sort of a very specific claim to the US, and people listening online, they might be more familiar with this than people in the room. But before they passed the unfortunately named Big Beautiful Bill, this was quite a big policy discussion. industry was very strongly saying we don't have enough mid-band spectrum. Because it's the US, they compare themselves to China. So China has all this mid-band spectrum and we don't. And it's a claim that started with the mobile industry, but did make its way all the way up to regulatory. But from Brendan Carr there, he wrote a letter to a Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation in March, where he said America's been falling behind China, the other nations when it comes to the amount of prime mid-band spectrum necessary to power new innovations. I think the mobile industry has successfully put that claim up there, and now the head of the FCC saying it. Not me thinking if it's true. So here's one of the charts the CTIA put out. The darker colors are the available spectrum. It tells a very clear picture. There's not much mid-band spectrum in the US. China is allocated 3.2 times more mid-band spectrum than the US, was the big picture claim. Before I get to the answer, some data from our app, Signal Tracker. I think it's interesting to, obviously intuitively, it makes sense that mid-band spectrum is important. The operators say it's important and it provides a better experience. It feels intuitive to engineers, I'm sure, but it also bears true in the data. So our speed test results for 3.5 gigahertz, 3.6 gigahertz show results that are much faster, about 3 times as fast as our 700 megahertz readings. And I think that is true. So I'm not saying any of this to say mid-band spectrum is not uniquely important for the mobile industry. I think it is, just because of the bandwidth available. So just putting some numbers behind this claim you hear all the time about how important it is.
Do you have the download speed? Do you have normalized it to the used bandwidth, or is it just the absolute value?
It's if a test was recorded in a certain band, here's the download speed that it achieved.
Yeah, but you don't consider the different bandwidth of the different bands the user can
for all that.
It's a total. It's the absolute. Okay.
Second time we've heard that, so we should do that. Because obviously it matters how much bandwidth you're using. Going back to the mid-band claim, specifically in the US, look at our database, and this bar chart came out on the right there. I added Germany, France, and the UK into it as well, just sort of as a benchmark. Our data showed that China has only about 40 megahertz more mid-band spectrum. So it's very comparable to the situation in the US. Why is there such a big difference between what we said and what the CTIA says? The CTIA is the mobile industry body. Should have mentioned that in the US. The main reason is the CTIA uses a very unusual definition of mid-band. So their definition is 3 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz. It just is unusual. I mean, previously they wouldn't have called that mid-band. They would have said 1 to 6. And if you do that, you exclude a lot of T-Mobile licenses and the 2.6 gigahertz band. That really does make a big difference. And I think they also, in what licenses they pick to include in their calculations, made some interesting choices. So when I did this, I was trying to compare sort of comparable spectrum of comparable value to mobile operators. They included 100 megahertz per operator in China, even though that's an indoor-only shared band. So I think it's not comparable to the other bands that are included. They included the lower 6 gigahertz band in China, which is a private network band. And I tried to stick to what's comparable. And I thought I would get some pushback on the choices I made, but no one has said anything so far. So I think I made them well.
Have you had any feedback from anyone in the US, CTIA or Verizon, AT&T? Probably don't care, but
I think the problem with this is it's over now, right? We have the 800 megahertz target. No one's looking at us anymore. So it's a bit moot at this point, but also excluded CBRS. New CBRS, it's not a high power license. It's not comparable to some of the other bands. So it's only fair to exclude it. But you can see how if you make a few different choices, you can tell a very different picture. I could make it so that China appeared better. I could make it so that China appeared worse. I tried to take an honest approach to comparable spectrum.
Depending on what story you want to tell.
Exactly. I think something some people have pointed out is in the future this could change. Obviously, China has allocated the other 6 GHz for IoT. They haven't assigned it yet, though, and it's very difficult to look forward and say in 10 years' time China will have this much mid-band spectrum, because we don't know when it will happen. We don't know if it will happen. Same is true for the US now with its 800 megahertz target. They very well may, well, NTA might find some spectrum, they might not. We'll see how that goes. So I think that the future prediction stuff is really difficult. This is what the situation is right now. There's a slight lead in China on mid-band spectrum availability, but it's not big at all. Okay. So the next claim sounds a bit more esoteric. It's about 5G standalone, basically. I think a lot of people in the industry view 5G broadly as a bit of a failure. Didn't bring quite the revenues that some had hoped. The next sort of thing they're looking at is 5G standalone. So it's being promoted as quite a transformative technology. I think the big focus of it is enterprise, obviously. With 5G standalone, you can do things like network slicing, although that was possible on 4G as well. RedCap, all these sort of enterprise specific technologies, that's the big selling point. I think there's also an argument to consumers. If you go to EE in the UK and you subscribe to one of their standalone plans, it'll be a lot more expensive than the regular plans. So they're selling it as an improved technology. I'm sure they hope will drive revenue as well. Verizon in the US is promising speeds of 3.3 gigabits per second on 5G standalone to their customers. I can't say much about the enterprise case. I think enterprise for the mobile industry is quite small. Private networks are quite small as an industry. I don't know where they're going to go. It's difficult to say at this point. But I can show a bit of data about from our app that we've seen on 5G standalone. So this is from all of our tests based on the technology that was connected at the time. 5G standalone is by far the fastest technology with average speeds of 110 megabits per second. You can use our app anywhere. I think this is slightly biased towards the UK, which is worth mentioning. Go ahead, Martin.
Isn't 5G standalone, 5G non-standalone just kind of the mobile industry messing around with words? I mean, what do you mean? Do we mean 5G with a 5G core that's using spectrum that was released for 5G?
It's the core.
Or is just 5G non-standalone? Any thoughts on that?
Well, 5G standalone is different, right? You have 5G throughout the whole chain and in the core. I think, do consumers know the difference? I don't know. If you're very cynical, you could say 5G non-standalone was just 4G steps. But I don't know.
How do you see fixed wireless access? Is 5G SA a need for fixed wireless access, considering that what we have seen in CBRS, what we have seen in US, what at least in US FWA is some are saying it's a killer for 5G. So is FWA dependent from 5G SA, or from your point of view?
I'm not an engineer, but my understanding is you can do fixed wireless access on 4G. You could do it on non-standalone 5G. Of course, it would be better on standalone 5G. It's a better version of 5G.
FWA is an alternative to the fiber and to the satellite. So the data rate is very important.
That's true.
Okay, you are not. It's really a broadband access. So the data rate is important if you want to qualify or to sell fixed wireless access. And I believe what I see, meaning that 5G SA is much better than 5G NSA. So my take on it would be that if you do a fixed wireless access, you have to migrate to 5G SA, and I think this is what is happening with, of course, T-Mobile, but also Verizon and AT&T. So my understanding was that the MNOs realize this and they will migrate to 5G SA. They will not stay with this Frankenstein kind of architecture. So, would you agree to that, or
Maybe.
that MNOs will fully move and will fully go for 5G SA?
It depends on the market. In the US, standalone is being invested in much more than in Europe. And it might be because fixed wireless access is such a big, it's becoming a very good business for the mobile operators there. But I think a lot of regulators in Europe think about standalone. They worry that Europe is not moving quickly enough. That just reflects a business decision from the mobile operator side. Whatever the reason is that they don't feel it necessary, a lot of them just don't feel it necessary.
So I have a question about this statement. So I know here we're comparing just the data download speeds, but I do believe that 5G standalone, while it's here in terms of data, it might show that it provides minor improvement. But then there are a lot of other services or aspects that could the MNOs could provide in terms of latency, slicing. Have you looked at these other factors that could improve because of the standalone?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's difficult to measure, right? It's hard to get an overview of what enterprises are using, what they need. So that to me is a little bit of an unknown at the moment. I think it is a good technology for that, but it just feels unlikely to me to sort of transform the business. I spoke to Vodafone about, in Germany, they launched a network slicing product that you can set up really easily. And I said, what happens if you don't have standalone? And then they said, well, then we'll use our 4G network slicing solution. That tells me, this as a technology, it's existed and it hasn't maybe exploded. And why should it explode now if the technology is just slightly better? It's hard to see that fundamentally changing things, even if it is very good at doing things like supporting network slicing and all these features.
I have a question. Have you analyzed the differences in the usage across the different regions? I was recently in a meeting in Africa, in Kenya, and there was a perspective from regulators there with mid-band spectrum talking about the 3.5 gigahertz, where basically they made it available for 5G deployment in their country, but the mobile operators basically did nothing with it, saying that 4G for them is enough and they don't see a return on investment if they were to deploy 5G there. So have you looked into the differences in usage everywhere? We know that the mobile industry is looking for spectrum everywhere, but it seems that the demand is very, very different from one region to another. I know that here we're very Europe-centric and USA-centric, and there it seems that there is a key difference in some of these applications, even though I see your second statement that for the user above a certain speed, it might not make a huge difference for the end user. I don't know if you had that perspective, global perspective and differences as well.
Right. Our data is a little bit Eurocentric as well, and just where we have it collected.
Yeah.
Getting more measurements out of places like India. So it's really interesting to do that going forward. Any project or apps. So we're not at a point yet where we can see really nuanced regional differences, I would say. I didn't mention any of these points. I think, 5G standalone is very fast. Does it make a difference to the end consumer? It's difficult to say. I think there's an agreement that anything over 20 megabits per second is just a bit of a luxury and doesn't fundamentally change the experience. That's not me saying that. Ericsson says that as well. And coverage at the moment in Europe is really lacking on 5G standalone. So although this looks pretty good on a chart, for us, this is only 3% of our tests at the moment. Touched on that last point there. Answering your question. The best for last. I wanted to make sure to upset everyone. 6 gigahertz. I think the argument for around 6 gigahertz, the mobile guys wanted, the Wi-Fi guys wanted it. The arguments are all based on, to me, future demand. And so if I look at the data, I can't say too much about it because I can't look into the future. But I do like pointing out that both industries do want the band for quite similar reasons. They want to improve capacity. They want to support futuristic use cases, VR, XR, 8K. I did this slide a few years ago, but now it's AI as well. And they want to have faster speeds, and that makes sense, right? The arguments around it are quite existential. I've heard people in the mobile industry say to me, how can we have 6G without 6 gigahertz? I don't know. I think you probably still can, but all to say, these are all very similar arguments actually from both sides. And I think I understand why many regulators like Ofcom find themselves in the middle of that, thinking, well, you have no clear answers from both sides on what will happen. We just have to take their word for it. So I'd just like to point out that a lot of people in the Wi-Fi industry are very critical of mobile data traffic going down. I spoke about that last year. That trend has continued, and I think it's a great point. But I think if you look at fixed network traffic as well, sort of anagram for Wi-Fi, it's also going down. So if 6 gigahertz is meant to enable all these high capacity features, yeah, that's something consumers need right now when they're actually sort of using data at a slowing rate, or the data growth is slowing slightly.
Richard, welcome.
Yeah.
If you look at the ITUR figures of mobile and fixed traffic growth, they show that in 2024, actually fixed traffic grew more than mobile. Mobile went down, fixed as well, but fixed went up again last year. So slightly different from those figures here.
I'll have a look at some more figures then.
And who submitted those numbers to ITU? The Wi-Fi industry?
No. I don't know how they collected them, but I trust the ITUR, of course.
So I don't have any answers for this particular argument. I think it's worth just saying that the data can only tell us so much with 6 gigahertz. And yeah.
Sure. And if both are shrinking, people connecting less and people using less.
Growth rates. So growth is still increasing, but
Okay.
it's growing at a slower rate.
Much.
Actually, there's some interesting things happening in terms of website traffic. I don't know if it's AI causing this, but a lot of big websites have seen traffic go down. Less people are visiting the website. It hasn't quite reflected in data rates, but it's one to watch that, I think.
I'm just observing recent statements by the likes of NVIDIA and Facebook, the glasses, and they're saying in the future it's going to be about the uplink for AI, because it's all about what are we seeing and pushing that video up. So are you seeing anything happening there? And is anyone saying we better start looking at more up and down? Because at the moment we're more down than up.
It's true with AI, it's more uplink heavy traffic-wise. I think it's just a really small scale. The last Ericsson mobility report, they had a good section on AI. I think they found, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but the very top end users of these AI apps were doing like 2 megabit a month or something. So that doesn't seem like, even if it's uplink heavy, like it's going to crash the
We're all
network.
wearing glasses in here, and we're all uplink.
I don't see any Ray-Ban method.
So one question. So you said on the previous slide that Ofcom has to take for their word whatever the industry is saying, and then the next slide you just show a simple fact. Why Ofcom does not have this fact to make their decision? Can you explain that? Why Ofcom will not go just up to the next slide, but just keeping to their word? And the regulator in general, I mean, we have seen on the previous one, the FCC basically believing that China is really well ahead on the mid-band spectrum, and you just make a slide saying yes. I mean, this is not true. So what prevents regulators to get facts rather than just to listen to industry lobbies? What's your take on that?
Maybe I'll let Ofcom answer in a sec, but I think I disagree with this slightly. I think Ofcom is seeing this, and they're seeing this and saying, what the hell do we do with that? That both technologies are trending or are seeing a slowdown. So therefore, how can we do 700 megahertz one way or the other? I think they are seeing that, and that's why they're conflicted on it. I don't think there is a clear answer to it, personally, but maybe we'll hear from Ofcom
Yeah, no, you're right. We do see this data. I mean, we collect a lot of this data. We have an annual report called Connected Nations, which does exactly this. It looks at data from mobile operators and the fixed networks on, you know, coverage, on traffic, how it's growing. We have an awful lot of data. So we're seeing these trends. I think the difficulty is, of course, you know, that you've got historic data, you then have to project it forward. And how do you project it forward? Because, you know, you've got a single line going from 2025, but, you know, I've no idea how you've generated that projection going forward. When we do our analysis, we look at different scenarios. So we're not saying, well, we know what it's happened historically, but what's going to happen in the future? So you have to look at different scenarios of, well, data might grow more quickly for whatever reason than it has historically. It might continue with the same trend. It might decrease. And then you have to make decisions based on what you think the range of plausible scenarios will be. So, you know, it's
Nice answer. I'm not convinced yet, but
I have one question about the data. I guess you have looked into that, but I've seen data from the mobile IoT industry when they talk about mobile use bit rates, they include mobile Wi-Fi. Sometimes they include Wi-Fi as a mobile service into their mobile data, which is not the right way, of course, but I've seen that, and I hope that they are not trying to trick us here again. So yeah, I've seen that in the past.
Do you mean they include fixed wireless, or do they include?
No, it's a Wi-Fi is per regulation a mobile service.
Yeah.
So sometimes I've seen reports when they say this is a mobile data rates percentage, whatever growth rate, and if you look in the data, you find out okay, it's a 4G, 5G connection and the Wi-Fi, including because it's mobile. It's mobile because mobile means one part of the system is moving. So if you have a smartphone, if it is connected to Wi-Fi, it is also mobile. So sometimes it's a trick to look better. And I've seen that. I'm wondering, I haven't looked up the numbers. I hope that GSMA is doing a good job here, but just as a reminder, and we might have to look into that.
Keep an eye on. Okay, that's.